Chapter 9. The Trial. The great moment had come and gone. It was over, and not a single grown-up had appeared. The children's demonstration had passed almost unnoticed by the very people it was aimed at. All their efforts had been in vain. The big red sun was already sinking into a sea of purple cloud, so low in the sky that its rays lit only the topmost tier of steps in the amphitheater, where so many hundreds of children had been waiting for so long. No cheerful hum of voices broke the sad, disconsolate silence. The shadows were lengthening fast. It would soon be dark, and the children began to shiver in the chill evening air. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck 8. Doubt gave way to certainty. The whole scheme had been a complete fiasco. One or two children got up and drifted off. Others followed suit. None of them said a word. Their disappointment was too great. Eventually, Paolo came over to Momo and said, "It's no use waiting any longer. No one will turn up now. Good night." And he walked off too. Franco was the next to leave. "It's hopeless," he said. "We can't count on the grown-ups. We know that now. I never did trust them anyway. As far as I'm concerned, they can stew in their own juice from now on." More and more children left. It was dark by the time the last of them gave up and went home, leaving Momo alone with Guido and Beppo. The old road sweeper stood up. "Are you going too?" Momo asked. "I've got to," Beppo told her with a sigh. "I'm on night duty." "Night duty?" "Yes, unloading garbage at the municipal dump. I'm due there in half an hour." "But it's Sunday. Besides, you've never had to do that before." "No, but we've been told to report there. They say it's only temporary. There's too much garbage to handle, apparently. Shortage of staff and so on." "What a shame," said Momo. "I'd have liked you to stay a while." "Yes, I don't want to go myself, but there it is. I've got to." And Beppo mounted his squeaky old bicycle and pedaled off into the darkness. Guido was whistling a soft and melancholy tune. He could whistle very sweetly, and Momo was listening with pleasure when he suddenly broke off. "Heavens!" he exclaimed. "I must go too. Today's when I start my new job. Night watchman. Didn't I tell you? I had forgotten the time." Momo just stared at him and said nothing. "So our plan didn't work out," he went on. "Never mind, Momo. It didn't work out the way I hoped either, but it was fun all the same. Tremendous fun." When Momo still said nothing, he stroked her hair soothingly and added, "Don't take it so hard, Momo. Everything will look quite different in the morning. We'll just have to come up with a new idea. A new game, eh?" "It wasn't a game," Momo said in a muffled voice. Guido stood up. "Look, I know how you feel, but we'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? I have to go now. I'm late enough as it is. Anyway, it's time you went to bed." And he walked off, whistling his melancholy tune. So Momo remained sitting forlornly in the great stone bowl of the amphitheater. Clouds had veiled the sky and blotted out the stars. A peculiar breeze had sprung up, light but persistent and singularly cold. If breezes can be said to have a color, this one was gray. Far away, beyond the outskirts of the city, loomed the massive municipal garbage dump. It was a veritable mountain of ash, cinders, broken glass, and china. Tin cans, plastic containers, old mattresses, cardboard cartons, and countless other objects discarded by the city's inhabitants, all waiting to be fed, bit by bit, into huge incinerators. Beppo and his workmates toiled for hours, shoveling garbage out of a long line of trucks. The trucks crept forward, headlights blazing, but the more they emptied, the longer the line became. "Faster!" the foreman kept shouting. "Hurry it up, or we'll never be through." They didn't finish the job till midnight, by which time Beppo's shirt was clinging to his back. Being older than the rest, and not the most robust of men, he flopped down wearily on an upturned plastic bucket, and struggled to get his breath back. "Hey, Beppo," one of his workmates called. "We're off home now. Coming?" In a minute, wheezed Beppo. He clasped one hand to his aching chest. Feeling all right, old man? Called someone else. I'm fine, Beppo called back. Just taking a little breather, that's all. Don't wait for me. Okay, said the others. Good night. And off they went. It was quiet when they'd gone, except for an occasional rustle and squeak from the rats scrabbling in the garbage. Beppo pillowed his head on his folded arms and dozed off. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep when he was roused by a gust of cold air. One look was enough to jolt him awake in an instant. All over the huge mound of garbage stood gray figures, attired in smart gray suits and gray bowler hats, steel gray briefcases in their hands and small gray cigars in their mouths. They were gazing fixedly, silently, at the summit of the mound. There, ensconced on a sort of magistrate's bench, sat 3 men identical to the others in every respect. Beppo was frightened for a moment. He had no business to be there. He sensed that instinctively, and the prospect of discovery scared him. Very soon, however, he realized that the army of gray figures had eyes for no one but the 3-man tribunal. Either they had failed to notice him at all, or they had mistaken him for some discarded object. Whatever the explanation, he resolved to keep as still as a mouse. Then the silence was broken by a voice from the judge's bench. The Supreme Court is now in session, announced the central figure. Call agent number BLW/553/C. The cry was repeated further down the slope and repeated again some distance away, like an echo. Threading his way slowly through the crowd and up the mound of garbage came a man in gray, distinguishable from his fellows only by the pallor of his face, which was almost white. At last he reached the tribunal. You are agent number BLW/553/C, asked the man in the center. I am. How long have you been employed by the time-saving bank? Ever since I came into existence, Your Honor. That goes without saying. Kindly spare us such irrelevancies. When did you come into existence? 11 years, 3 months, 6 days, 8 hours, 32 minutes, and, at this precise moment, 18 seconds ago. Oddly enough, although this exchange was being conducted a long way off and in low, monotonous voices, Beppo didn't miss a word of it. Are you aware, the man in the center went on, that a substantial number of children paraded through the streets today with placards and banners, and that they even entertained the outrageous notion of inviting the whole city to attend a briefing on our activities? It hadn't escaped me, replied the agent. How do you account for the fact that these children knew about us and our activities? The senior inquisitor pursued remorselessly. It's a mystery to me, Your Honor, said the agent. If I may venture a personal observation, however, I would urge the Supreme Court not to take this incident more seriously than it deserves. It was a piece of childish nonsense, that's all. I would also urge the court to bear in mind that we easily managed to scotch the scheduled meeting by leaving people no time to attend it. Even had we failed to do so, however, I'm confident that everyone would have dismissed the children's information as a cock-and-bull story. In my opinion, we would have done better to let the meeting go ahead, because that would— Defendant, the judge broke in sharply. Do you realize where you are? The agent wilted. Yes, he whispered. This is no human court, the judge continued. You are being tried by your own kind. Lying to us is futile. You know that perfectly well, so why bother to try? It's an occupational habit, the agent stammered. It is for this court to decide how seriously to take the children's intentions. However, I need hardly remind you that children present a greater threat to our work than anyone or anything else. I know, the agent conceded meekly. Children, declared the judge, are our natural enemies. But for them, mankind would have been completely in our power long ago. Adults are far easier to turn into time-savers. That's why one of our most sacred commandments states, leave the children till last. Are you familiar with that commandment, defendant? Yes, indeed, Your Honor, said the agent, puffing hard at his cigar. It was a peculiar fact that, despite the solemnity of the occasion, all present, judges, defendant, and spectators, were smoking incessantly. And yet, the judge retorted, we have incontrovertible proof that one of us, I repeat, one of us, not only got into conversation with a child, but betrayed us. Do you happen to know who that certain person was? Agent number BLW/553/C wilted still more. It was me, Your Honor. And why did you break our most sacred commandment? Because the child in question had been seriously impeding our work by turning people against us. I had the interests of the time-saving bank at heart. My intentions were of the best. Your intentions don't concern us, the judge said icily. Results are all that count here, and the result of your unauthorized action has been to gain us no time and acquaint a child with some of our most vital secrets. Do you admit that? The agent hung his head. I do, he whispered. So you plead guilty? Yes, Your Honor, but I would draw the court's attention to an extenuating circumstance. I was genuinely bewitched, lured into betraying us by the way the child listened to me. I can't explain how it happened, but I swear that's the way it was. Your excuses are irrelevant and immaterial. This court takes no account of extenuating circumstances. The law is quite categorical on this point, and allows of no exceptions. However, we shall certainly devote some attention to this unusual child. What is its name? Momo, Your Honor. Male or female? She's a girl. Place of residence? The ruined amphitheater. Very well, said the judge, who had recorded all these details in his notebook. You may rest assured, defendant, that this child will never harm us again. We shall neutralize her by every available means. Let that thought console you, now that sentence is about to be passed and carried out. The agent began to tremble. What is the sentence? He whispered. The three judges put their heads together and conferred in an undertone. Then they nodded, and their spokesman turned to face the prisoner again. Agent number BLW/553/C, having pleaded guilty to a charge of high treason, this court unanimously sentences him to pay the penalty prescribed by law. He is to be deprived of all time forthwith. Mercy! Mercy! Shrieked the agent, but his steel-gray briefcase and small cigar had already been snatched away by two gray figures standing beside him. And then a very strange thing happened. No sooner had the condemned man lost his cigar than he started to become more and more transparent. His screams grew fainter, too, as he stood there with his head in his hands, dissolving into thin air. The last that could be seen of him was a little flurry of ash, eddying in the breeze, but that soon vanished, too. Silently, the men in gray dispersed, judges and spectators alike. Once the darkness had swallowed them up, the sole reminder of their presence was a chill gray wind that swirled around the dismal and deserted garbage dump. Beppo continued to sit, spellbound on his upturned bucket, staring at the spot where the condemned man had been standing. He felt as if his limbs had turned to ice and were only just beginning to thaw. The men in gray existed. He had seen them for himself. At about the same time, the distant church clock had already struck 12. Momo was still sitting on the steps of the amphitheater. She was waiting. For what, she didn't know, but some instinct had dissuaded her from going to bed. All of a sudden, something lightly brushed against her bare foot. Peering hard, for it was very dark, she saw a big tortoise looking up at her. Its mouth seemed to curve in a mysterious smile, and there was such a friendly light in its shrewd black eyes that Momo felt it was about to speak. She bent down and tickled it under the chin. "Who might you be?" she said softly. "Nice of you to come and keep me company, Tortoise, even if nobody else will. What can I do for you?" Momo wasn't sure whether she'd failed to notice them before, or whether they'd only just appeared, but she suddenly spotted some letters on the tortoise's back. They were faintly luminous, and seemed to follow the natural patterns on its shell. "Follow me," she slowly deciphered. Astonished, she sat up with a jerk. "Do you mean me?" she asked. But the tortoise had already set off. After a few steps, it paused and looked back. "It really does mean me," Momo said to herself. She got up and went over to the creature. "Keep going," she told it softly. "I'm right behind you." And step by step, she followed the tortoise as it slowly, very slowly, led her out of the amphitheater and headed for the city. Chapter 10. More haste, less speed. Old Beppo was pedaling through the darkness on his squeaky bicycle, pedaling with all his might. The grey judge's words still rang in his ears. "We shall certainly devote some attention to this unusual child. You may rest assured that this child will never harm us again. We shall neutralize her by every available means." Momo was in dire peril. Of that there could be no doubt. He must go to her at once, warn her and protect her from the men in grey. He didn't know how, but he'd find a way. Beppo pedaled even faster, his tuft of white hair fluttering in the breeze. He still had a long way to go. The ruined amphitheater was ablaze with the headlights of a whole fleet of smart grey cars, which hemmed it in on every side. Dozens of men in grey were scurrying up and down the grass-grown steps. At last, after peering into every nook and cranny, they came upon the hole in the wall. Some of them scrambled through it into Momo's room. They looked under the bed. They even looked inside the little brick stove. Then they reappeared, patted the dust from their smart grey suits, and shrugged. "The bird appears to have flown," said one. "It's exasperating," said another. "Children should be safely tucked up in bed at this hour, not gallivanting around in the dark." "I don't like the look of this," said a third. "It's almost as if someone had tipped her off just in time." "Impossible," said the first. "He couldn't have known of our intention before we knew it ourselves. Or could he?" The three of them eyed each other in dismay. "If someone really did tip her off," the third pointed out, "she'll have made herself scarce. We'll only be wasting time if we go on looking for her here." "What do you suggest, then?" "I say we should notify headquarters at once, so they can launch a full-scale manhunt. The first thing they'll ask us, and quite rightly so, is whether we've made a thorough search of the immediate neighborhood." "Very well," said the first speaker. "Let's search the area first, but if the girl's well clear of it already, we'll be making a big mistake." "Nonsense," snapped his colleague. "Even if she is, headquarters can still launch a full-scale manhunt using every available agent. The girl won't escape. She doesn't stand a chance. Right, gentlemen? Let's get going. You all know what's at stake." Many of the local inhabitants lay awake that night, wondering why so many cars kept racing past their windows. Even the narrowest side streets and roughest farm tracks resounded until daybreak, with a roar of traffic more usually heard on major roads. No one could sleep a wink. All this time, Momo was trudging slowly through the city, in the wake of her newfound friend, the tortoise. The city never slept nowadays, however late the hour. Interminable streams of people surged through the streets, jostling and elbowing each other aside. The roads were choked with cars and big, noisy, overcrowded buses. Neon signs blazed down from every building, intermittently bathing passers-by in their multicolored glare. Momo, who had never seen any of this before, followed the tortoise in a kind of wide-eyed, waking dream. They made their way across broad squares and down brightly lit streets. Cars flashed past them and pedestrians milled around them, but no one looked twice at the child and the tortoise. They never had to get out of anyone's way, either. Nobody bumped into them, nor did any driver have to brake to avoid them. The tortoise seemed to know precisely when there would be no car or pedestrian in their path, so they never had to vary their pace, never had to hurry or stop and wait. Momo began to wonder how any two creatures could walk so slowly but travel so fast. When Beppo finally reached the amphitheater, the feeble glow of his bicycle lamp showed him, even before he dismounted, that the ground around it was a mass of tire tracks. He left his bicycle in the grass and ran to the hole in the wall. Momo. He whispered the name at first, and then spoke it aloud. Momo, he repeated. No answer. Beppo swallowed hard. His throat felt so dry. He climbed through the hole into the pitch-black room, stumbled over something, and wrenched his ankle. Striking a match with tremulous fingers, he peered in all directions. The crude little table and chairs were overturned, the blankets and mattresses stripped off the bed. Of Momo herself, there was no sign at all. Beppo bit his lip to stifle the hoarse sob that racked his chest at the sight of this desolation. My God, he muttered, I'm too late. She's gone. They've spirited the poor girl away. What shall I do now? What can I do? Just then the match began to burn his fingers, so he dropped it and stood there in the dark. Making his way outside as fast as his twisted ankle would allow, he hobbled over to his bicycle, struggled back into the saddle, and pedaled off again. Guido must help, he kept repeating. He must. Pray heaven I can find him. He knew that Guido planned to earn some extra money by spending Sunday nights in the storeroom of a car breaker's. He knew that Guido planned to earn some extra money by spending Sunday nights in the storeroom of a car breaker's junkyard. Serviceable parts had been disappearing of late, and it was Guido's job to see that this pilfering ceased. When Beppo ran him to ground in a shed beside the junkyard and hammered on the door with his fist, Guido at first mistook him for a would-be stealer of spare parts and kept mum. And then, recognizing the old man's voice, he unlocked the door. What's the matter? He grumbled. It's Momo, Beppo told him breathlessly. She's in danger. What are you talking about? Asked Guido, flopping down on his camp bed. Momo? Why, what's happened to her? I don't know exactly, Beppo panted, but it doesn't look good. And he told Guido all he'd seen, from the trial on the garbage dump, to the tire tracks around the amphitheater, to Momo's ransacked and deserted room. He took quite a while to get it all out, of course, because not even the concern and anxiety he felt for Momo could make him speak any faster than he usually did. I knew it all along, he concluded. I knew it would end in disaster. Well, now they've taken their revenge. They've kidnapped her. We've got to help her, Guido. But how? How? The blood had slowly drained from Guido's cheeks while Beppo was speaking. He felt as if the ground had given way beneath him. Till now, he'd regarded the whole affair as a splendid game, and taken it neither more or less seriously than he took any game or story. Now, for the first time ever, a story had escaped his control. It had taken on a life of its own, and all the imagination in the world would be insufficient to halt it. He felt numb. You know, Beppo, he said after a while, Momo may simply have gone for a walk. She does that occasionally. Like the time she went roaming around the countryside for 3 whole days and nights. We may be worrying for no good reason. What about the tire tracks? Beppo demanded angrily. What about the state of her room? Guido refused to be drawn. Suppose they really did come looking for her, he said. Who's to say they found her? Perhaps she'd gone by the time they got to her. Why else would they have searched the place and turned it upside down? But what if they did find her? Beppo shouted. What then? He gripped his young friend by the lapels and shook him. Don't be a fool, Guido. The men in grey are real, I tell you. We've got to do something, and fast. Steady on, Guido said soothingly, startled by the old man's vehemence. Of course we'll do something, but not before we've thought it over carefully. After all, we don't even know where to look for her. Beppo released him. I'm going to the police, he announced. You can't do that, Guido protested with a look of horror. Have some sense, Beppo. Suppose they found her. Don't you know what they'd do with her? Don't you know where waifs and strays end up? They'd stick her in a home, with bars over the windows. You wouldn't want that, would you? No, Beppo muttered helplessly. Of course not, but what if she's really in trouble? What if she isn't? Guido argued. What if she's only gone for a bit of a ramble, and you set the police on her? I wouldn't like to be in your shoes then. She might never want to see you again. Beppo subsided onto a chair and buried his face in his hands. "I just don't know what to do," he groaned. "I just don't know." "Well," said Guido, "I vote we wait till tomorrow, or the day after, before we do anything at all. If she still isn't back, okay, we'll go to the police. My guess is everything will have sorted itself out long before then, and the three of us will be laughing at this whole silly business." "You think so?" muttered Beppo, suddenly overcome with fatigue. The day's excitements had been a bit too much for a man of his age. "Of course," Guido assured him. He eased Beppo's boots off and wrapped his sprained ankle in a damp cloth, then helped him onto his camp bed. "Don't worry," he said softly. "Everything's going to be fine." But Beppo was already asleep. Sighing, Guido stretched out on the floor with his jacket under his head in place of a pillow. Sleep eluded him, though. He couldn't stop thinking about the men in gray all night long, and for the first time in his happy-go-lucky life, he felt frightened. The time-saving bank had launched a full-scale manhunt. Every agent in the city was instructed by headquarters to drop everything else and concentrate on finding the girl known as Momo. Every street teemed with gray figures. They lay in wait on rooftops and lurked in sewers, staked out the airport and railway stations, kept an unobtrusive watch on buses and trams. In short, they were everywhere at once, but they still didn't find the girl known as Momo. "I say, Tortoise," said Momo as the pair of them made their way across a darkened courtyard, "aren't you going to tell me where you're taking me?" Some letters took shape on the tortoise's shell. "Don't be scared," they read. "I'm not," said Momo, when she deciphered them, though she said it more to boost her courage than anything else. Truth to tell, she did feel rather apprehensive. The tortoise's route was becoming steadily more tortuous and erratic. It had already taken them across parks, over bridges, and through subways, into buildings and along corridors, even, once or twice, through cellars. Had Momo known that she was being hunted by a whole army of men in gray, she would probably have felt uneasier still, but she didn't. So she followed the tortoise patiently, step by step, as it continued to meander along. It was lucky she did. Just as the creature had previously threaded its way through traffic, so it now seemed to know exactly where and when their pursuers would appear. There were times when the men in gray reached a spot only moments after they themselves had passed it, but hunters and hunted never actually bumped into each other. "It's a good thing I've learned to read so well," Momo remarked casually, "isn't it?" Instantly the tortoise's shell flashed a warning. "Shh!" Momo couldn't understand the reason for this injunction, but she obeyed it. Then she saw 3 dim gray shapes flit past a few feet away. They had now reached a part of the city where each building looked drabber and shabbier than the last. Towering tenements with peeling walls flanked streets pitted with potholes full of stagnant water. The whole neighborhood was dark and deserted. At long last, word reached the headquarters of the time-saving bank that Momo had been sighted. "Excellent," said the duty officer. "Have you taken her into custody?" "No, she disappeared before we could nab her. She seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. We lost track of her again." "How did it happen?" "If only we knew. There's something fishy going on." "Where was she when you sighted her?" "That's the odd thing. She was in a part of the city completely unknown to us." "There's no such place," said the duty officer. "There must be. It seems to be, how shall I put it, right on the very edge of time, and the girl was heading that way." "What?" yelped the duty officer. "After her again! You've got to catch her before she gets there. At all costs, is that clear?" "Understood, sir," came the ashen-voiced answer. Momo might almost have imagined that day was breaking, except that the strange glow appeared so suddenly, just as they turned a corner, to be exact. It wasn't dark anymore, nor was it light, nor did the glow resemble the half-light of dawn or dusk. It was a radiance that outlined every object with unnatural crispness and clarity, yet it seemed to come from nowhere, or rather from everywhere at once. The long black shadows cast by everything, even the tiniest pebble, ran in all directions, as if the tree over there were lit from the left, and the building over there from the right, the monument over there from dead ahead. The monument, if that was what it was, looked weird enough in itself. It consisted of a big square block of black stone, surmounted by a gigantic white egg, nothing more. The houses, too, were unlike any Momo had ever seen, with dazzling white walls and windows cloaked in shadows so dark and dense that it was impossible to tell whether anyone lived inside. Somehow, though, Momo sensed that these houses hadn't been built for people to live in, but for some mysterious and quite different purpose. The streets were completely empty, not only of people, but of dogs and cats and birds and cars. Not a movement or breath of wind disturbed the utter stillness. The whole district might have been encased in glass. Although the tortoise was plodding along more slowly than ever, Momo again found herself marveling at their rate of progress. Beyond the borders of this strange part of town, where it was still night-time, 3 smart gray limousines came racing down the potholed street with headlights blazing. Each was manned by several agents, and one of them, who was in the leading car, caught sight of Momo just as she turned into the street with the white houses and the unearthly glow coming from it. When they reached the corner, however, something quite incomprehensible happened. The convoy came to a sudden stop. The drivers stepped on their accelerators. Engines roared and wheels spun, but the cars themselves refused to budge. They might have been on a conveyor belt traveling at exactly the same speed, but in the opposite direction. And the more they accelerated, the faster it went. By the time the men in gray grasped the truth, Momo was almost out of sight. Cursing, they jumped out and tried to overtake her on foot. They sprinted hard, grimacing with rage and exertion, but much the same thing happened. When they were finally compelled to give up, they had covered a mere 10 yards. Meanwhile, Momo had disappeared among the snow-white houses and was nowhere to be seen. "That's that," said one of the men in gray. "It's no use. We'll never catch her now." "Why were we rooted to the spot?" demanded another. "I just don't understand it." "Neither do I," said the first. "The only question is, will they take that into our favor when we come back empty-handed?" "You mean they may put us on trial?" "Well, they certainly won't give us a pat on the back." All the agents looked downcast. Perching on the wings and bumpers of their gray limousines, they brooded on the price of failure. There was no point in hurrying. Not now. Far, far away by this time, somewhere in the maze of deserted, snow-white streets and squares, Momo continued to follow the tortoise. Despite their leisurely progress, or because of it, the streets and buildings seemed to flash past in a white blur. The tortoise turned yet another corner, and Momo, following close behind, stopped short in amazement. The street ahead of them was unlike all the rest. It was really more of an alleyway than a street. The close-packed buildings on either side were a mass of little turrets, gables, and balconies. They resembled dainty glass palaces, which, after lying on the seabed since time out of mind, had risen suddenly to the surface. Draped in seaweed and encrusted with barnacles and coral, they shimmered gently with all the iridescent rainbow hues of mother-of-pearl. The narrow street ended in a house detached from all the others, and standing at right angles to them. Its big bronze front door was richly decorated with ornamental figures. Momo glanced up at the street sign immediately above her. It was a slab of white marble, and on it, in gold lettering, were the words, "Never Lane." Although she had taken only a second or two to look at the sign and read it, the tortoise was already far ahead, and had almost reached the house at the end of the lane. "Wait for me, Tortoise!" she called, but for some strange reason she couldn't hear her own voice. The tortoise seemed to have heard, though, because it paused and looked around. Momo tried to follow, but no sooner had she set off down Never Lane than a curious sensation gripped her. She felt as if she were toiling upstream against a mighty torrent, or battling with an inaudible tempest that threatened to blow her backwards. Bent almost double, she braced her body against the mysterious force, hauling herself along hand over hand or crawling on all fours. She could just make out the little figure of the tortoise waiting patiently at the end of the lane. "I'm getting nowhere," she called at last. "Help me, can't you?" Slowly, the tortoise retraced its steps. When it came to a halt in front of her, its shell bore the following advice: "Walk backwards." Momo tried it. She turned around and walked backwards, and all at once she was progressing up the lane with the utmost ease. At the same time, something most peculiar happened to her. While walking backwards, she was also thinking, breathing, and feeling backwards. Living backwards, in fact. At length, she bumped into something solid. Turning, she found she was standing outside the last house of all, the one that stood at right angles to the rest. She gave a little start, because, seen at this range, the ornate bronze door looked enormous. "I wonder if I'll ever get it open," she thought, but at that moment the massive door swung open by itself. She paused again, distracted by the sight of another sign above the door. This one, which was supported by the figure of a unicorn carved in ivory, read, "Nowhere House." Because she was still rather slow at reading, the door had begun to close again by the time she'd finished. She slipped hurriedly inside, and it shut behind her, with a sound like muffled thunder. Momo found herself in a long, lofty passage, flanked at regular intervals by marble statues, whose apparent function was to support the ceiling. There was no sign here of the mysterious current that prevailed outside in the lane. Momo followed the tortoise as it waddled ahead of her down the long corridor. At the far end, it stopped outside a little door, just big enough for Momo to duck through. "We're there," the tortoise's shell announced. There was a little sign on the door. Kneeling down so that it was on a level with her nose, Momo read the inscription. "Professor Secundus Minutus Hora," it said. She drew a deep breath and boldly lifted the latch. As soon as the little door opened, her ears were assailed by a melodious chorus of tinkling and chiming and ticking and humming and whirring. She followed the tortoise inside, and the latch clicked into place behind them.